The first thing I noticed was the temperature of the floor. It was late September, not cold yet, only that first mild stretch in the Hudson Valley when the mornings smelled a little like wet stone and old apples. I was standing in the lower pantry of a house so large it had 2 kitchens and 3 sets of stairs that led to nowhere a practical person would ever need to go. One of my boots was on slate, the other on a section of oak that had been fitted so cleanly into the floor that I almost missed the seam. The oak was warmer than it should have been. Not hot. Not suspicious in any theatrical way. Just warmer than the rest of the room. With a faint vibration you could feel better through the bones than the skin. I stood there with my clipboard tucked under one arm and my coffee cooling in my hand, looking at a room full of unopened olive oil, imported salt, French preserves, and shelf after shelf of hand-labeled wine. And I remember thinking that somebody had spent a lot of money making sure even their hidden spaces felt finished. That was my first thought. My second was that there was active mechanical equipment beneath me in a house whose primary owner had been dead for almost 9 months. At the time, I did what I usually do when something in a building does not match its paperwork. I wrote it down. Lower pantry. South side. Localized heat and low-frequency vibration beneath flooring. Possible concealed plant access or conditioned subspace. Verify on system walkthrough. That was on a Tuesday. By Friday afternoon, the roads into town were slow with state police and private ambulances. The pharmacy on Main had a handwritten sign taped to the door about insulin delays, and I had begun loading my van with more canned beans than one man with no children at home could honestly justify. I did not panic. I never really have. Panic is expensive. It burns through time, and time is usually the one thing a person still has if he can keep his head long enough to look at what is actually in front of him. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 46 that fall, and for most of the previous 12 years, I had run a small estate transition company out of Kingston. Before that, I worked in museum collection storage, which is just a more careful and less emotional way of dealing with the same basic truth. People build lives out of objects, systems, habits, and arrangements, and eventually someone else has to sort them. My company handled the period after death and before dispersal. We photographed, inventoried, tagged, staged, packed, coordinated donations, supervised movers, negotiated with heirs who had not spoken to one another in years, and tried, when possible, not to let grief turn into logistics any faster than necessary. It was steady work if you had the temperament for it. You learned to notice details. You learned which drawers mattered. You learned the difference between things people displayed and things they used. You learned that most households, regardless of wealth, ran on the same few quiet systems, where the spare batteries were kept, who knew how to reset the well pump, which mug someone always reached for first, whether the pantry held food anyone could actually cook. You also learned that rich people were not as different as they wanted to be. They simply built more layers between themselves and discomfort. The house with the warm floor belonged to Owen Vale, or had. Vale was one of those men who became a category before he became a memory. Private equity, logistics, data infrastructure, a foundation with his name on it, a conference center at a university, profile pieces in magazines that photographed him looking out of windows as if he had personally invented glass. He and his second wife had built the property on a ridge above the river, all limestone, cedar, poured concrete, and impossible panes of glass. The local paper had called it a residence. It was closer to a private campus with a view. I had the contract because his daughter, who lived in London, and seemed to regard the entire house as an administrative inconvenience, wanted the place evaluated, stabilized, and prepared for partial liquidation before winter. The legal side was still tangled. The staffing side was worse. The longtime house manager had quit in August after waiting 6 months for back pay that never came. The grounds crew was down to one older man who only showed up on Thursdays. The security subcontractor had been replaced twice. Normally, that kind of disorder makes estate work slower, but simpler. You proceed room by room. You document everything. You ask questions later. What made that job different was the way the property kept behaving, like it was still occupied by someone more punctual than the dead. Exterior cameras were live, though not all on the same software. The radiant heat worked in selected zones. The backup generator self-tested every Thursday at 11. One lower-level hallway stayed precisely 68 degrees, no matter what I did with the local thermostat. And down in the pantry, beneath that warmed strip of wood, something deeper in the house continued to hum. I had a driver then, part-time, named Keisha, and on Wednesday, she found me sitting on an upturned moving crate in the garage, looking through a stack of mechanical binders the size of city phone books. "You look like you're about to invoice someone for being annoying," she said. "I might," I told her. She leaned on the workbench and looked toward the open bay doors, where rain was falling in a fine gray sheet over the circular drive. "You still coming in tomorrow?" "Probably. Even with all this?" She said it lightly, but I knew what she meant. For about a week, nobody in town had been using plain nouns if they could help it. Everything arrived as a phrase. "That thing down in Westchester. Whatever's going around. That hospital problem. The attacks." If you asked directly, people would tell you the same few facts and then begin diluting them with nerves. Patients were becoming aggressive. There were unusual bite injuries. Some nursing homes had gone into hard lockdown. A produce distributor outside Newborough had suspended routes because half the warehouse staff hadn't shown up, and the other half refused night shifts. Emergency rooms were overwhelmed. State officials were calling it a neurological event, complicated by infection. The videos online were grainy, repetitive, and easy to doubt individually. Collectively, they were harder to dismiss. "I'm coming in tomorrow," I said, "at least until I know what I'm looking at." Keisha nodded as if that was about the house and not the county. Good. Because if the world is ending, I'd still like those payroll files signed. I signed them on the hood of the van. It felt like the right scale of seriousness for the moment. At home that evening, I made pasta, called my daughter Nora in Albany, and tried to sound like a father who was checking in rather than a man making preliminary calculations. Nora was 21, studying landscape architecture, and had inherited her mother's ability to hear what I was trying not to say. "You think I should come down?" she said. "I think you should top off your car, buy shelf-stable food, and keep your phone charged." "That means yes." "It means I've watched the same news you have." "You don't watch the news. You watch inventory behavior and gas lines." That was true. I've never had much faith in the emotional timing of official statements. Buildings and supply chains usually tell the truth first. All week, my clients had been behaving in ways that did not match the reassurances on television. 2 families with weekend houses had asked whether I could recommend someone to install interior deadbolts on doors that already had security systems worth more than my van. A retired cardiac surgeon in Rhinebeck, who had spent 20 years downsizing with saintly calm, suddenly wanted all of her canned goods packed separately from the rest of the kitchen. One of the regional funeral homes had called to ask if I knew anyone leasing refrigerated storage. The owner sounded tired enough that I did not ask why. That kind of pattern recognition is not dramatic. It is not a thunderclap. It is a slow filing into place of little practical things that should not all be moving in the same direction unless something larger is leaning on them. By Thursday morning, I had a legal pad on my passenger seat with 3 columns: fuel, water, and people. Under fuel, I wrote the addresses of the last stations in town that still had regular gas and diesel. Under water, I listed how many gallons I could reasonably store in my duplex without the floors regretting it. Under people, I wrote 5 names and crossed out 2 of them almost immediately. Not because I did not care about those 2, because caring and planning are not always the same function. I had been divorced for 8 years by then, but Sandra and I still spoke twice a week and saw each other more often than some married people. She was the head librarian at the branch in Saugerties and had a better instinct than I did for whether a situation was likely to become moral before it became logistical. When I called her from the Vale property that afternoon, she listened to me describe the warm floor, the live systems, the supply patterns, and the county advisory that had just shifted from caution to movement restrictions in 3 affected zones. Then she said, "You're making a list of places that still work." "Yes. And you already have one you're not admitting as a real option." I looked through the service corridor window toward the lawn. The house sat on 43 acres, terraced and landscaped, with a guest house, carriage barn, greenhouse, and a long gravel drive that wound down to the road through beech and maple. There were stone retaining walls, buried propane tanks, discrete drainage lines, and enough backup infrastructure on the site to keep a boutique hotel comfortable for a month. "I don't know what it is yet," I said. "You don't need to know what it was built for. You need to know what it can do." That is one of the reasons Sandra and I stayed on speaking terms. She was usually looking at the actual question a good 10 minutes before I was willing to name it. So, after I hung up, I went back to the binders. The architectural set had no underground level beyond a wine room, mechanical chase, and storm-rated storage. The electrical set listed a secondary distribution panel with load branches that did not appear anywhere else. The geothermal loop field was oversized for the conditioned square footage shown on paper. There was a gray-boxed notation in one appendix referring to owner continuity systems under a separate vendor contract. That phrase sat there on the page with all the polite vagueness money buys when it wants preparation not to sound like fear. At 4:15, while the sky was beginning to go white with rain and the upstairs motion sensors had stopped registering anyone but me, I found the access. It was not in the pantry floor after all. It was behind the 3rd rack in the wine room, where the bottles from Burgundy ended and the mock panel began. A magnetic latch released when I tapped a sequence from the maintenance notes in the wrong binder. The rack shifted outward a 1/2 inch, with the softest hydraulic sigh I have ever heard, and behind it was a narrow service door with no visible handle. When it opened, conditioned air touched my face. Cool, dry, filtered. The light inside came on in stages, floor level first, then wall strips, then the ceiling. A short corridor led to an elevator, brushed steel, nothing ostentatious. A small screen glowed beside it with a status summary. Continuity level: active. Life support: stable. Water reserve: 87%. Battery capacity: 94%. Air handling: nominal. I stood there a long moment with my clipboard still in my hand, like a fool who had brought office supplies to the edge of a secret. Then I did what I always do when I am unsure whether I am intruding on something beyond my authority. I looked for the manual. There was one in a recessed cabinet next to the lift, 3 binders deep, labeled with the restrained confidence of a private contractor, certain no normal person would ever see them. The system had a name, though I do not remember it exactly now. Something abstract and expensive sounding. Haven platform, maybe. Continuum. It hardly mattered. What mattered was that the Vale shelter was not a panic room or a fortified basement. It was a fully independent underground residence designed for 12 long-term occupants, with expandable support capacity for support staff during short-duration events. It had its own water treatment, battery storage, diesel backup, medical room, laundry, dry pantry, cold storage, communications hub, bunk rooms, owner suite, recirculated air system with layered filtration, and maintenance workshop. It had 2 hidden exits and a freight lift disguised as a mower bay in the lower equipment garage. It had a software layer governing access, consumption, and environmental control. It had not shut down because it had never been told to. It had, in other words, survived the death of its owner better than most families survive Thanksgiving. I took the elevator down. The shelter was not glamorous in the way the house above was glamorous. That surprised me. I had expected brass and theater, maybe a tasting lounge with ballistic glass. What I found was cleaner and more sober. Concrete walls faced in pale ash panels, soft indirect lighting, wide corridors with rounded corners, doors that closed firmly but not loudly, floors in a matte material that felt good underfoot and probably cost more per square yard than the tile in my kitchen. The main living space looked like a Scandinavian hotel lobby designed by someone with unresolved trust issues. Low shelves, long sofas, storage built into every wall, a kitchen with induction tops and stainless pullouts, dining tables fixed to the floor. There were no windows, of course, but several large displays showed camera feeds from the grounds above, along with weather, air quality, power status, and water levels. The mechanical areas were what interested me most. A central equipment room held battery arrays, manifold banks, controls, transfer switches, filtration housings, and pumps, all labeled with an accuracy that suggested one competent engineer had once bullied every contractor on the project into behaving. The water came from a drilled well deeper than the house well, with triple-stage treatment and a cistern buffer. Waste went through a contained treatment system capable of reduced water operation. The climate control was divided into loops, so unused sections could be shut down. The pantry alone could have made a nervous suburban family feel prophetic for years. And it was all still on. Not in standby, not abandoned. Running, cycling, monitoring itself, waiting for a biometric roster that had never arrived. I should probably say, because stories like this tend to make people imagine greed before they imagine maintenance, that I did not have any immediate plan to claim the place as mine. My first feeling was professional irritation. A hidden space that large, on an estate under active review, should have been disclosed. The legal liability alone was enough to make me sit down at the communications desk and close my eyes for a moment. My second feeling was simpler: relief. Because for the first time all week, I was standing inside a system whose capacities I could measure. Outside, everything was turning verbal. Statements, speculation, rumor, reassurance, denial. Inside that shelter, the water reserve was either 87% or it was not. The air filters had a remaining service life expressed in hours. The freezer temperature held at 2 degrees. The battery showed actual numbers. I cannot pretend that did not calm me. When people say they want safety, what they often mean is legibility. I stayed until almost 7, reading manuals and making notes while rain ticked faintly over however many tons of earth and concrete lay above me. Before I left, I printed the system map from the console, folded it into my notebook, and locked everything exactly as I had found it. Then I drove to 3 different stores and bought, among other things, water containers, 2 camp stoves, a hand crank radio, dried lentils, cat litter I did not need, bleach, and more batteries than any ordinary evening would justify. The woman ahead of me at the feed store was buying fencing staples, propane, pediatric cough syrup, and 6 bags of rice. She smiled at me in the tired, embarrassed way people do when they sense they are behaving collectively. That night, I slept badly, not because I was afraid, but because my mind kept sorting possibilities into rooms. By Saturday, the county had issued travel advisories. By Sunday, certain roads were effectively closed by congestion, if not by policy. The videos online became clearer, which made them easier to disbelieve emotionally and harder to dispute structurally. Emergency calls were being rerouted by volume. The first people I knew personally who failed to answer their phones were not the dramatic ones, not thrill seekers or conspiracy enthusiasts, but a dental hygienist, a school custodian, and the assistant manager of a garden center. Ordinary people with ordinary habits tend to disappear from systems in a way you can graph. I went to see the shelter again on Sunday afternoon, this time with intention. I brought a flashlight, work gloves, 2 legal pads, my laptop, a duffel bag of basic supplies, and Theo Alvarez. Theo had done well and pump work across Ulster and Dutchess counties for almost 20 years. He was one of those men who could tell you the age of a pressure tank by the color of the rust on the fittings, and he had the kind of practical imagination that makes someone useful in the first week of anything bad. He was also, which mattered just as much, not sentimental about property owned by men like Owen Vale. When I showed him the concealed door, he let out a low whistle and said, of course he had one of these. Why, of course? The rich always want to hide from the consequences of what they're connected to. They just like to call it resilience. Once downstairs, Theo became respectfully quiet. He ran his fingers along the plumbing manifolds, checked the pump room, looked over the treatment tanks, and nodded to himself in short, measured intervals. This is good work, he said eventually. Wasteful in places. Over-designed, but good. Could people live here? People already planned to. No, I mean normal people. He looked at me. That depends on whether you mean physically or morally. That was the question, though I still was not ready to say it in plain terms. By then, I had narrowed my people list to 4 names: Sandra, Theo, Marisol Vega, and June Han. Marisol was a hospice nurse who had worked with 3 client families over the years and possessed a steadiness I trusted more than official guidance. She knew medication, wound care, practical hygiene, and the difference between discomfort and danger. June ran nutrition services for a regional school district and could feed 100 people from what looked like ingredients for 15. Sandra, as I said, was a librarian, which sounds ornamental until the world begins fraying at the level of record-keeping, calm communication, and human morale. I called them that evening from my dining room table while the local station played soft jazz, as if the county were not slowly coming apart. I did not dramatize anything. I told them what I had found. I told them what it could do. I told them I was trying to decide whether my duty, professional and personal, was to preserve the site for its legal owners or to treat it as the only intact survival infrastructure within easy reach of town. Sandra said yes before I finished. June asked about freezer capacity, dry storage, and water quality. Marisol asked if there was a quarantine room. Theo said, "I'm bringing my own tools." By Monday morning, schools were closed. The library never opened. The advisory became a shelter-in-place order. With so many exceptions, it mostly served to announce that the government had moved from prevention to containment language. Sandra came straight to my duplex with 2 crates of branch records, a tote of children's paperbacks she could not bear to leave, and her old percolator. Marisol arrived in scrubs under a rain jacket, carrying a medication box, a blood pressure cuff, and 3 gallons of distilled water. June brought food service gloves, kitchen knives wrapped in dish towels, yeast, rice, and a notebook already divided into meal cycles. Theo showed up with pipe dope, fittings, hand tools, testing strips, 2 cases of bottled water, and a 5-gallon bucket of hardware that looked like the condensed essence of competence. We caravanned to the Vale estate just after noon. I remember that drive with a strange tenderness, because the world had not fully declared itself yet. The trees were beginning to turn. Mailboxes were still upright. A dog stood in one yard watching us pass with the self-serious expression dogs wear when cars move too slowly. At the farm stand outside town, someone had written "Cash Only" on a cardboard sign in thick red marker. A state truck went by the other way, lights on, in no clear hurry. The first infected person I saw up close was in the parking lot of a dental practice less than a mile from the estate. A woman in business clothes, maybe mid-50s, standing with one shoe off,
First thing I noticed
and
was
both
the
hands
applesauce.
resting flat on the
Not
hood
because
of the sedan,
applesauce is dramatic.
as if she were trying to remember what cars were for. Her hair was loose. There was something dark along the front of her blouse. She looked, more than anything, exhausted. I slowed. Sandra put a hand on my arm. "Keep driving," she said softly. I did. There was no cruelty in it, only sequence. We still had somewhere to reach and a structure to establish. The moral life does not disappear in a crisis. It just becomes more dependent on order. At the estate, we moved quietly and without ceremony. Front gate shut, vehicles inside, inventory of what was already on site, check of all entries, assessment of generator fuel. By function, rather than by room. That afternoon, the shelter stopped being a secret and became a place. I gave everyone the tour in the same calm tone I might have used to introduce a property to an appraiser. Main access via wine room lift, secondary freight route through equipment bay, emergency egress tunnel to lower retaining wall. Owner suite unnecessary. Use bunk rooms first. Medical room here. Laundry here. Pantry dry goods here. Cold room here. Mechanical in the rear. No one touches valves without Theo. Comm station central. Battery storage isolated. Air handlers overhead. Service only. Waterboard on this wall. Shut-offs labeled. June stood in the pantry for a long time with her hands on her hips, looking at shelves of vacuum-sealed grains, freeze-dried fruit, canned fish, boxed milk, powdered eggs, supplements, and snacks curated by someone who had clearly outsourced his fear to a consultant. "Well," she said at last, "he expected to live through the end of the world without giving up imported almonds." Marisol laughed for the first time in days. We all needed that. By evening we had settled on a first principle. The shelter would not be used as a tomb for the lucky. If we stayed, it would be because it could function as a stable base from which to support life beyond its original guest list. That sounds noble in summary. In practice, it meant we spent the next 6 hours discussing toilets, intake protocols, sleeping assignments, surface exposure, medication limits, food burn rate, and what level of contact with the outside world was survivable. I took the small room off communications because I wanted easy access to the controls, and because old habits die hard. Sandra chose a bunk near the common room, saying if people were going to wake in the night, she preferred to hear them before they decided to whisper. Marisol converted one of the flex offices into an exam room using supply cabinets already stocked with basics and a cot folded into the wall. June claimed the kitchen without needing to say so. Theo moved through mechanical spaces with the serene concentration of a man, finally in a building that respected machines enough to give them room. Routine began the next morning. That may sound fast, but routine is always the first mercy. We woke at 6:30 to lights rising gradually from warm dimness to full daylight temperature. That had been programmed into the shelter, and rather than resist it, we kept it. Coffee by 7. Water review by 7:30. Surface check. Camera feeds. Perimeter look from the house above, and weather. Then tasks. We made a whiteboard from the back of an auction sign and hung it by the kitchen. Water. Theo. Medical/sanitation. Marisol. Food/inventory. Rotation. June. Comms/records. Sandra. Site/access/planning. Me. The roles were flexible, but naming them mattered. It kept us from turning into a cluster of capable people, each waiting to see what the others might do. Systems are rarely more than agreements made visible. The shelter itself helped. It had been designed to reduce friction for a small, disciplined group. Storage was where it should be. Equipment labels were legible. Ventilation was quiet. The laundry machines were commercial grade. There were built-in floor drains in all the useful places. Someone, somewhere in the construction process, had believed that hidden wealth should at least be well organized. Once we stopped reacting to the absurdity of the thing, we began improving it. Theo adjusted the water treatment cycle to conserve filter life without compromising potability. He isolated 2 little-used loops and reduced unnecessary circulation. June took the pantry software at face value for 10 minutes, declared it a rich man's fantasy spreadsheet, and rebuilt the food inventory by actual meal logic. Proteins, starches, fats, salts, comfort items, morale items, long cook versus short cook. She found 3 years' worth of premium whiskey and turned part of the shelf space into legumes. Marisol inventoried the medical suite and found, unsurprisingly, excellent trauma kits, broad-spectrum antibiotics, sedatives, sterile dressings, IV supplies, and the sort of concierge medicine stock wealthy people keep around, as if mortality can be negotiated with a card on file. What the room lacked were the ordinary things actual communities need in quantity: reading glasses, maintenance medications, inhalers, children's dosage forms, durable mobility aids, diabetic supplies. She wrote a list. Sandra created paper records for everything: notebooks, check-in sheets, shift logs, messages received, messages sent, food usage, incidents. When I asked why she preferred paper when the shelter had servers and backup drives, she said, "Because if I hand you a notebook, you will use it. If I tell you to open a folder tree, you'll wait until after lunch." She was correct. For the first 4 days, we did not bring anyone else in. That choice still sits with me, though not in the guilty way people assume. It sits with me because of how ordinary it felt. The world was changing very quickly above ground, but beneath it we were boiling water, making lists, wiping counters, bundling linens, learning the sounds of the ventilation cycle, and deciding what counted as enough certainty before widening the circle. On the camera feeds, the grounds remained beautiful. Deer passed the lower fence at dawn. Leaves collected in the corners of the terrace. Rain moved over the tennis court in long silver diagonals. Once, on the 3rd morning, a man in a security jacket walked up the drive, rang the bell twice, waited, and then sat down on the stone bench by the gate, as if he had simply become too tired to continue. He stayed there for almost an hour. Then he stood and went back down the road. None of us went out to meet him. It is easy to judge these decisions in retrospect, from the warm side of safety. But safety itself is made of such decisions, and each one acquires meaning from all the others around it. What changed our plan was not pleading, or threat, or heroism. It was insulin. On the 5th day, while Sandra was monitoring county radio traffic from the communications desk, she picked up a weak local transmission, repeated every 15 minutes on a school district band. The voice was male, thin with fatigue, and careful in the way people get when they have decided panic is an indulgence. This is Ellenville Elementary Shelter Group. We have 19 total, including 3 insulin-dependent adults and 1 child with asthma. Water pressure intermittent. Refrigeration failing. If anyone is operating stable power or has medical capacity, respond on repeat. He gave the message 3 times in exactly the same wording. June looked at me from across the kitchen. Marisol had already set down what she was doing. The school kitchen, June said. Walk-in coolers won't hold without steady power. If they've moved people in there, they're using the cafeteria. Theo asked the practical question first. How far? Too far to carry insulin on foot and too close not to matter, I said. Nobody said what we were all thinking, which was that the shelter as designed could hold 12 in comfort and perhaps 18 in strain, but not 19 more on top of us, not without turning a carefully built system into a fast failure. That evening, after dinner, we sat around the fixed dining table underground, with a legal pad between us, and worked through the numbers. Water was good if managed correctly. Food was better than good if supplemented from the house and greenhouse. Air capacity was not the limiting factor. Space and sanitation were. The shelter could house a core group and treat short-term visitors, but if we suddenly filled it with everyone we could help, we would lose the very order that made it useful. The question isn't whether we open it, Sandra said. The question is what opening it means. That was the first moment the shelter truly became ours, not by ownership, but by interpretation. Owen Vale had built the place to preserve selected continuity. Chosen people, chosen comforts, chosen credentials. The software reflected that. Authorized occupants, tiered access, personal suites, consumption dashboards. It was a machine for extending privilege underground. We decided to turn it into infrastructure instead. The next 2 days were the most satisfying work I have ever done in a crisis. Not dramatic work, useful work. Theo and I mapped the site's external utility runs and found a service corridor from the shelter plant to the greenhouse annex and carriage barn. With some effort and a little unauthorized rewiring, we were able to create a limited surface use zone, refrigeration in the annex, charging in the carriage barn, water fill at an exterior maintenance sink, all without exposing the main shelter entrance. Theo called it making the rich man's burrow socially productive. June converted part of the annex kitchen to bulk prep and organized hot meal cycles that could be portioned out without inviting people fully inside the secure core. Sandra built a message system using whiteboards, radio windows, and posted schedules. Marisol prepared a triage space in the old tasting room off the wine cellar, close enough to underground medical supplies to support it, separate enough to contain uncertainty. We established 3 boundaries. First, the underground shelter itself would remain a controlled core for sleeping, medical storage, water treatment, records, and power control. Second, the annex and carriage barn would become our public interface zone during daylight hours. Third, nobody unknown entered the core without assessment, and nobody from the core went wandering off to solve abstract problems. We were not building salvation. We were building reliable capacity. On the 8th day, I drove with Marisol and Theo to the elementary school. The roads were not empty, which somehow made them stranger. Some cars moved normally. Others sat where they had stopped, doors open, as if their owners had stepped away to answer a question and never returned. A sanitation truck blocked half an intersection near the post office. At a gas station, 2 men were arguing in the soft, exhausted voices people use when they are too depleted to escalate. We saw only 2 infected up close on that drive, both wandering near the edge of a soccer field in the kind of aimless, persistent way that had by then become more frightening than aggression. There was no spectacle to it, just a failure to stop. The school shelter was being run as well as anyone could have run it. Cots in the library, dry goods in labeled bins, classrooms assigned by household group, a hand-washing station rigged from beverage coolers, and a folding table. Their radio operator, the man whose voice we had heard, turned out to be a vice principal named Glenn, with a careful manner and a face that seemed to have aged 10 years in 1 week. When I explained what we had, not a refuge for 19, but power support, refrigeration, treated water, and medical consultation. He closed his eyes a moment and said, "That's enough. I mean that sincerely. That is enough." That sentence reorganized something in me. Up to then, I had still been thinking in terms of what the shelter could not do. It could not take everyone. It could not fix the county. It could not restore public order. It could not make the roads safe. It could not be made morally pure. What it could do was enough to change the conditions of survival for more people than its original design ever intended. We brought back 2 insulin coolers, 3 patients for medical assessment, and a handwritten list of needs longer than the legal pad on which it was written. Over the next week, the Vale estate became a quiet exchange point. Not advertised widely, not hidden absolutely, but signaled carefully through the few functioning channels still trusted: school radio, church bulletin board, ham operators, word carried by people who could follow instructions. Daylight drop-offs only. No overnight stays in the annex without clearance. Bring containers for water. Medical consult window from 10 to noon. Battery charging from 1 to 4. No firearms inside the service zone. No exceptions, announced loudly. It was astonishing how quickly ordinary order reassembled itself once there was a reliable place to pin it to. A retired auto shop teacher named Malcolm rebuilt 2 cargo bikes from parts in the carriage barn and began running medicines and notes between 3 clusters of survivors who could not safely drive. A widow from Rosendale named Elise, who had once managed a conference center kitchen, joined June, and within a day had improved our entire food workflow with a level of quiet authority I admired instantly. Sandra started a lending shelf in the annex with paperbacks, crossword books, and children's coloring supplies because waiting rooms become more human if they admit time. She was right. Even the shelter's software became, in its own way, useful once we stopped obeying its assumptions. At first, it fought us in petty, elegant ways. Lighting profiles reverted to owner preferences. Door permissions defaulted to non-existent family members. Inventory categories treated bottled water as a lifestyle amenity rather than a structural resource. One sub called Comfort Textiles legacy softs muttered about for an entire afternoon while sorting blankets. But beneath the vanity, there was solid control architecture. I learned the panel logic well enough to override occupancy allocations, redirect load priorities, and open or close wings according to actual need, rather than imagined hierarchy. We turned the owner's exercise studio into long-term dry storage. We converted a lounge meant for investor retreats into a classroom and message room for the children who came through. We stripped biometric restrictions from the medical cabinets. Theo rigged the upper lawn irrigation feed into a wash station for contaminated clothing. Step by step, we taught the place that it had been built for the wrong story. There were hard days. One of Glenn's diabetic patients, an older man named Raymond, came in with a foot infection already too advanced for what Marisol could do on site. We kept him comfortable, coordinated antibiotics, and bought him another month, maybe 6 weeks. Not enough, but real. A pair of brothers from out near Accord tried to force entry through the lower service drive after hearing rumors about the bunker. They were frightened rather than malicious, but fear with a truck can still do structural harm. We spoke to them from behind the closed equipment bay door, gave them water, directed them to the school shelter, and made it clear they would not enter by force. Afterward, Theo reinforced the outer gate using materials from the stable and said, not unkindly, "Generosity needs hinges." There were mornings when the radio traffic was so thin, it felt like listening across weather rather than distance. There were evenings when everyone underground grew irritable for no grand reason, other than recycled air, constrained movement, and the simple abrasion of being needed. Still, because the work was real, the strain stayed bearable. In late October, after nearly 3 weeks at the estate, I took a walk alone through the empty house above. I had not spent much time there once the system below became our focus. The rooms already felt like a deflated performance, huge white sofas nobody had softened. Art lit for observers rather than dwellers. A breakfast room with 6 kinds of tea, and no sign that anyone had ever been comforted there. In the study, I found Vale's desk untouched, the surface clean except for a fountain pen, a framed photograph of the river in winter, and a leather folio containing site plans, investment summaries, and private notes on resilience strategy. That phrase again. I sat in his chair and read for almost an hour. There was no confession, no villain's diary, nothing satisfying in the dramatic sense. Just a wealthy man's attempt to manage uncertainty through systems, consultants, and layers of control. He had funded disease surveillance ventures, private logistics contingencies, water rights research, security analysis, agricultural land hedges. He had assumed the future would become uneven and had built accordingly. Not for society, for position. I did not hate him for it, which may disappoint certain listeners. I had spent too many years in other people's houses to sustain clean moral emotions toward the dead. What I felt instead was a kind of weary clarity. He had seen enough of what was coming to protect select continuity, and not enough, or not care enough, to make that protection public. Below his house, we were now using that same infrastructure to keep librarians, nurses, cafeteria managers, teachers, mechanics, and children fed, washed, cooled, and connected. I took the folio downstairs and put it in Sandra's records cabinet. That night, over lentil stew and sourdough June had somehow coaxed into existence in a billionaire's shelter. I told the others what I had found. So he knew in the general sense, Sandra said. He knew systems were brittle, I said. He prepared for that. And now? Marisol asked. I looked around the table. The percolator steamed softly beside June's ledger. Theo's wrench sat near his elbow because he forgot to put it down at dinner. Sandra had a stack of returned books at her feet, all with names written inside in pencil. From the medical room came the faint hum of the dedicated fridge, where insulin now sat in careful rows. Now, I said, the system inside is still running. It's just running for the wrong billionaire. June smiled into her bowl. Good. By November, the leaves were down, and the estate had settled into a pattern that would have looked almost ordinary from the right distance. Morning fires in the annex stove, water fills by schedule, medical consults 3 days a week, radio window at noon and dusk, meals standardized enough to simplify shopping from our own stores and occasional scavenged deliveries, oats, rice, beans, canned tomatoes, powdered milk, apples when we could get them, greenhouse greens, eggs from a nearby property once Malcolm got that family back on their feet. We built a root storage rack in the old wine cave. We insulated the carriage barn doors with packing blankets and foam from shipping crates. Theo winterized 2 exterior lines and rerouted one because he disliked inefficiency, the way some men dislike lies. My own routine narrowed and deepened. At 6 each morning I reviewed water, battery, fuel, weather, and occupancy. Then I walked the entire property if conditions allowed. I checked the gate, the lower drive, the retaining wall, the hidden service bay, and the greenhouse annex. I listened more than I looked. Buildings tell you how they are doing by sound, pump cadence, fan strain, drip locations, a door that no longer closes with confidence. In the afternoons, if the public interface zone was quiet, I returned to what had been my old profession and became, in essence, the steward of a single peculiar estate. I cataloged what we had turned from luxury into utility. Linens reassigned, wine racks emptied for canned goods, decorative storage baskets now holding wound dressings and soap, outdoor heaters cannibalized for parts. Conference chairs moved into the annex school corner. It soothed me, I think, to translate the house downward into function. Sometimes, in the slower hour after supper, Sandra and I would sit in the communications room with tea and talk the way former spouses can only talk once they have stopped needing each other to be symbols. "You seem calmer here than you did at home," she said once. "I know what the systems are." "That's not the same as knowing what will happen." "No," I said, "but it helps me know what I can offer." She thought about that. "You always did better with a task than with a feeling." That sounds unflattering. It isn't. Feelings need furniture too. That line stayed with me, because the truth is that by then, the shelter had become furniture for all sorts of things nobody had planned to place there. Grief, relief, irritation, new loyalty, old competence, boredom, tenderness, children's drawings, wet boots lined in a row, notes left for people who might come by later. A little shelf Sandra started near the annex door with gloves sorted by size and a handwritten sign that said, "Take a pair, leave a pair if you can." The infected remained real, but they did not define every hour. That was important to me, and still is when I tell the story. People imagine collapse as a continuous scream. Most of it is maintenance. Most of it is deciding whether the last onion goes into today's soup or tomorrow's. Most of it is standing in a doorway with someone and agreeing on which room is for what now. In mid-November, Nora finally reached us. Cell service had been intermittent for weeks, and the roads from Albany were unreliable, but she got a ride south in 2 stages with a survey crew turned mutual aid convoy and came up our drive in Malcolm's cargo trailer, wrapped in a borrowed parka, and carrying, unbelievably, a cardboard tube of studio drawings she still had not abandoned. When I saw her step down from the trailer by the carriage barn, I felt something in my chest loosen so quickly it made me lightheaded. She hugged me hard, looked past me toward the main house, then toward the annex, and finally said, "This is the most dad thing that has ever happened." "What is?" "You found a rich man's hidden infrastructure and turned it into a municipal service model." I laughed so hard I had to lean against the barn wall. Nora stayed. Of course she stayed. Within 2 days, she had mapped pedestrian routes across neighboring properties, reorganized the greenhouse work tables by actual workflow, and started planning spring beds on the south terrace, because she said, if we were going to be here through thaw, we might as well behave like people with a future. That changed the tone more than I would have predicted. Hope is often too grand a word. What she brought was continuity of season. We had been living from cycle to cycle. Meal, shift, radio window, supply run. But Nora began talking about soil depth, seed timing, frost cloth, drainage, compost, and sun angles on the retaining walls. She laid tracing paper over the estate map and started turning decorative land into productive land. It was the same instinct as mine, maybe only directed forward rather than inward. In December, snow came early. The grounds went quiet under it. The main house, mostly unheated now except in selected loops, stood above us like an elegant fossil. Down in the shelter, the air stayed temperate and dry. The batteries held. The water treatment purred along. The children who came through the annex pressed mittened hands to the glass of the greenhouse and fogged it with breath while Nora explained spinach. One night during the first serious storm, I went alone to the original access corridor behind the wine racks and stood there listening to the lift machinery hum softly in the walls. On the status screen, the same clean lines of information glowed. Air handling. Nominal. I thought about the man who had paid for it, about his private fear translated into polished redundancy, about the family who never arrived, about the months I had spent before all this sorting other people's belongings into categories small enough to transport. Then I thought about what was happening one level below and one level above me now. June proofing dough in a steel bowl because warm air moved best near the laundry exhaust. Theo asleep with a wrench on the floor beside his bunk. Marisol leaving dosage notes in careful script. Sandra repairing the spine of a children's atlas by lamplight. Nora turning a Billionaire's ornamental planters into spring seed trays. Malcolm arriving in the morning with 2 cartons of eggs and gossip from the school shelter. Glenn checking the insulin fridge like a priest at a side chapel. Wet gloves drying near the service sink. A whiteboard full of names and times and quantities. Not luxury, not salvation, just organized human use. The shelter was still running, yes, but by then I understood that running was not the same as alive. A system is only as moral as the pattern of life it permits. Everything else is engineering. That winter, we renamed the rooms. Not ceremonially, almost by accident. The owner suite became the South Dorm. The wellness studio became dry storage. The executive conference room became the school table. The tasting room became clinic intake. The continuity hub became the radio room. The surface annex was just the annex. The software still had its original labels buried in its menus, but nobody said them anymore. Language, like plumbing, eventually follows use. By January, people from 3 nearby clusters were relying on us in one way or another. Not all for shelter. Mostly for the boring essentials that keep bodies from becoming emergencies. Clean water, cold storage, medication advice, battery charging, route information, a stable place to leave messages, a quiet room to sit for 20 minutes while someone else watched your child. I do not want to exaggerate our scale. We were not a new town. We were not governance. We were one functioning site with unusually good infrastructure and a handful of competent adults who refused to let it remain private. That was enough. One afternoon, toward the end of February, I found myself back in the lower pantry where I had first felt the warm floor. Snowlight from a high window made the shelves look pale and flat. Most of the imported delicacies were long gone, traded, repurposed, or ignored. The room smelled faintly of onions, cardboard, and detergent now. I stood with my boots on the slate and looked at the place in the floor where the heat had first surprised me months earlier. Beneath it, hundreds of lines, valves, tanks, cables, controls, and routines continued their quiet work. Above it, a dead man's house had become a shell for a different kind of wealth altogether. If you have worked long enough in other people's homes, you learn that inheritance is rarely neat. Money moves according to law. Use moves according to need. Meaning moves according to whoever remains long enough to reorganize the drawers. The title people would give this story, if they needed one, would make it sound stranger than it felt inside it. A billionaire's underground shelter, a hidden system still running. Those parts are true, but the truth I remember most clearly is simpler. I found a place built to keep the world out. And because the world had already changed, we made it useful by letting just enough of the world in. That spring, when the ground softened, Nora and I laid out the first proper beds along the south terrace, with salvaged compost and seed stock traded through the school group. Sandra cataloged every book now circulating through the annex shelf, though she had given up trying to retrieve them all. June taught 2 teenagers how to scale soup without wasting fuel ball. Theo finally admitted he liked the battery room because, for once, something expensive is doing honest work. Marisol planted herbs in the old meditation courtyard outside the annex door because people recovering from fever, she said, deserved to smell something alive. The system inside was still running. Only now, when I checked the boards each morning, what I saw was not the dream of one prepared man. It was the shape of many ordinary people fitting themselves around a working set of tools and deciding, day after day, to keep it that way. There are worse endings than that. There are louder ones, cleaner ones perhaps, more final ones. But if you ask me how it actually felt, living there in those months beneath the ridge with the pump cycling and the kettle starting up and the radio waiting for noon, it felt less like hiding than like maintenance in its most generous form. And because I had spent so much of my life entering houses after stories were over, I recognized the privilege of standing inside one while a different story, quieter, less exclusive, more useful, was still being made.